Our first scripture reading today comes from Galatians 1, verses 11 through 17. Let us listen for the word of God. For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin. For I did not receive it from human sources, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Judaism. I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. But when God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me. But I went away at once to Arabia, and afterwards I returned to Damascus. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Second scripture reading today, it is actually part and parcel of what you just heard. So in Galatians, that letter that we just read, that is Paul's own take on his conversion experience. And what we're going to read now is that same conversion experience, but told by Luke in the book, The Acts of the Apostles. You'll see that it's slightly different from what Paul has to say, but it's nonetheless important. So, let's read. Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he asked, Who are you, Lord? The reply came, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. This is the word of the Lord. So we are doing our sermon series entitled Conversations, and of course each week we begin with a pre-taped conversation between members of our congregation. And so why don't we get that going, and then that's going to set the foundation for what we're going to talk about today.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That just gave me the chills. I grew up in the church. I mean, my parents took me as a kid, I remember, preschool and on up in the same church. So I think I've always been involved in a church, always.
For me, getting active in a church, I am Ukrainian Orthodox. So I was raised, both my parents are Ukrainian, and went to church every Sunday, Ukrainian Sunday school.
And we we went to Episcopal church. My father was Catholic, my mother was not. And belonging to the Episcopal church, I became an acolyte. Acolyte is an altar boy, and that is something I ended up doing for probably 5 years. About every other week I would do that.
To me, it's never been a matter of not being involved in a church, so I feel like that's super important. And I kind of lost my way, and that was the biggest thing I felt, is I missed that community.
Mm-hmm. When you don't have it, you feel
Yeah.
like you're kind of at a loss. I totally know what that means. Like in college, when I was not really a part of a church, it was like something's missing.
Yeah, so for me, I find it a period of calm during a very busy week. My wife and I both work, we both have kids. Between the activities with the kids and work, it's a long week, and I find it's a nice time on Sunday morning to kind of have some peace and reflect.
I'd say that our best friends are the people that we've met here at First Pres, and they're the people who we rely on within our family. And whenever we need something or something's not right, those are the people that we go to. And so it's definitely the people.
If I were brought up as a Muslim, I think I would probably, and I've had the same relationships that I had with family and friends, who were very close to being in church and that, I would probably remain a Muslim. And the reason being, at least as while I've been a Christian, I have not sought out any other religion. I have not gone and studied and found out what something else is, because I've always been satisfied with the religion I am.
I mean, I've been given amazing opportunities to go experience other faiths through being a confirmation teacher, and these places that I've gone, you know, there's always that sense of community. So being raised Christian has been a beautiful thing for me, but I also think that different non-Christian faiths share the same sense of family.
I don't know if I was to have been brought up somewhere else, if it definitely would have been a Christian community that I would have sought out, but it definitely would be a community that had the same beliefs and goals as I do.
I mean, you know, you'd have to convert to
Right.
Christianity, and I think
And I mean, that's also, you know, that's a possibility.
It's a
You know,
possibility.
one can be raised and then married to another one of, you know, someone in another faith, and that's their choice, and then that's the next chapter of their life, right?
I live by a very simple biblical thing: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I think that church offers so many opportunities for everybody in the congregation to pick and choose. We've all been given gifts, and we can pick and choose what our gifts are, what we're interested in.
I guess for me, it's just I feel a stronger connection with God if I'm with other people that feel the same connection. And I definitely feel stronger in my faith at a church than not at a church.
Yeah, and the group is, and the connection you make, it's so comfortable, and everyone's so giving and so honest about themselves that it's easy to push yourself in different directions and to think about things in different ways and to express when you're frustrated or when you're excited about something, because you know you're always going to be supported in whatever you're saying. And I think without those connections, it wouldn't be church.
I agree.
All right. So we're talking about today the concept of why are certain people drawn to religion? And I think this is a really interesting question, particularly given that in Western society today, we tend to be drawing away from organized religion. People no longer want to be part of organized religion. And I don't think that it's going to come as any shock to you that the church is experiencing a significant decline. And this is across the board. It doesn't matter whether you're conservative, moderate, liberal. Every church is seeing fewer and fewer people walk through their doors to replace the older generations. I've read an interesting statistic that based on the rate of decline in our denomination right now, that the Presbyterian Church will cease to exist by 2042. It's not too far away. And it's just based on the number of people who are dying, the number of people who are leaving. And so if you read the scholars, the religious sociologists who study this stuff, and you look at why they're saying this is happening, because they give you explanations as to why it's happening. They name a variety of different factors. One thing that they talk about is globalization, okay? Globalization. Now, what do they mean by globalization? Well, what they mean by that is that we live in a world today where we are aware of a lot of other religious traditions. 70, 80 years ago, when you were growing up in the church, well, you only knew the people you knew. You knew people who were like you. You might know one person who's Jewish, right? But you didn't really know a lot of different people out there. You were aware that those faiths existed, but you didn't know people in those faiths. And today, you do know. Everybody who's young grows up knowing people who are from a variety of different faiths. You know, I know people who are Muslim, Buddhist, Taoist. I know lots of atheists. I know all these different people who are out there. And so for the younger generation, it's much, much harder for us to sit there and say, well, one faith is more valid than another, because we're more aware than any other generation in history that just because you were born into a particular faith doesn't make that the right faith. Now, there's another situation that we're looking at in our culture today which is changing things too, which is the technological revolution, which is changing our sense of community and the way community operates. Used to be that the church was the center of community. Families, they came together to the church to be with one another. You could hear that in the video, couldn't you? About people who are coming to this church. They come here to be with other families. But that's changing very rapidly in our church today. And it's changing because the younger generation, their sense of community is actually found on the internet. That's where they come together. And the reason why is because the younger generation is so transient. They're always moving around. The millennial generation, which is now fixed. Sociologists have now fixed that timeline between 1982 and 2004. That makes you a millennial. Those people are changing jobs every 2 to 3 years. And when you're changing jobs that frequently, well, you're going to be moving around a lot, right? And of course, this has an impact for an institution like ours. The churches that you see around here, they were built with the intention of having people who are going to stay in a community for long periods of time. And they're going to invest in that community. That's how our churches are built to work. And so when the younger generation is moving around all the time, the church, the way we're designed right now, it cannot survive with that level of mobility. This is why you don't see a lot of 20 or 30-year-olds coming into our church, becoming members of our congregation. I mean, you see a few people here or there, but usually what happens is they come in for a short period of time, and then they move on. Last summer, it was really neat. We had this whole group of like 20-year-olds who were coming to this service. And I got to know them, and right as I was starting to get to know them, they moved on and went somewhere else. Now, these factors that I bring up to you, these are pieces of a much larger puzzle as to why the church is going through a decline. But in my opinion, these pieces are somewhat peripheral because they're cultural explanations. The truth is, what's happening right now is we are going through a reformation in our church. That's what's happening at this point in time. So 500 years ago, that was the last Reformation. We're in a Reformation right now. And of course, what happens during a Reformation is the churches that were strong, they end up dying off, and something new comes up in its place. And so the question I want to focus on today is not why is the church dying, because clearly it is. The question I want to focus on is who's going to be in the church once this Reformation has taken place? Who's going to be left in that church? And I think to get a sense of who's going to be there, we should look back at the last Reformation when this happened 500 years ago, because that's going to give us some hints and some clues. So prior to the 1500s, if you were walking around Europe through all these countries, you would have found that most of those countries were Roman Catholic. And the Vatican had done something very interesting. They'd gone into all these countries and they had had conversations with their leaders, and the leaders had put laws on the books mandating that people had to be in church on Sunday morning. That would be great here. It would really help us out a lot. So you had to be in church, right? You couldn't opt out. You couldn't sleep in. So then, shortly after 1500, you have people like Martin Luther and John Calvin. And they start protesting against the Catholic Church. They say, hey, we would like you to change what you're doing. And of course, what's the Catholic Church say? No, thank you. We're not going to change. And so they said, okay, we're going to go off and start our own churches. Martin Luther, what did he start? He started the Lutheran Church. John Calvin, he set the foundation for our church, Presbyterianism. And a lot of other people, they were setting up churches at this time. So you fast forward 100 years, and you get to about 1600. And all of a sudden, the Roman Catholic Church, they're not the dominant force anymore. And what happens is these churches, they have an influence on the laws, and they go in there and they start changing the laws, and it's no longer mandatory anymore because these guys, they felt that what you needed to do was let people have a choice, because it's your choice whether or not you believe in Jesus, right? So they repeal the laws. And you know what happens after they repeal the laws? An average of only 10% of the population kept going to church. after that. Now, that doesn't mean that the remaining 90% never went. They just went on the high holy days, which is kind of like today, right? Okay. So religious sociologists, when they figured that out, they wondered, is that unique to Europe, or is that something that's across the board? Is there something more universal with that? And so they started doing studies and surveys of different people around the world. They did studies of people who live in state-run religions, like places like Saudi Arabia that are Muslim. They went to places in South America. They went all around the world, and they started asking the questions that would allow them to know how involved are these people, and they came to the same conclusion. It's about 10%. Anywhere you go, 10% of the population is really religiously interested, while the remaining 90%, they are religiously ambivalent, meaning that their religion is not really core to who they are as a person, or they're religiously agnostic, meaning they don't really know what it is that they believe. So let's take this study and let's apply it to America. Now, do more than 10% of the population go to church on a Sunday morning? Yes, they do. If you look at the statistics, it's anywhere between 25 and 40%, which is roughly on the upper end, about 128 million people go to church on a Sunday morning. So what this study is saying is, if you remove all the motivating factors for why people go to church, so there's the social pressure that you need to be there, the business connections that people get through networking, or allowing it to be the focal point of the community. You remove all those things out of it, and what you're going to be left with is the 10% of people who are really, really dedicated to being in a religion. So as the church goes through this Reformation process and starts winnowing away, what's going to be left is this 10%, because when there's no social pressure to be there, right, then all of a sudden you lose all of your business and networking connections, and then it's no longer the focal point of the community. So this interesting little factor, it makes me wonder, well, what makes this 10% so different? What makes them tick? Why are they the way that they are? And so we're going to examine that, and we're going to try to figure out who is like the 10%. What are the 10% really all about? I think to get a sense of this, we need to go to the video that we watched, because in the video, that gives us a sense. Would you agree that the people in that video, they are religiously interested? Would you agree with that? Okay, so they would seem to be religiously interested to me. So what you can see from the start is that they all start in the same place, which is that they were all raised in the faith from childhood, right? And so it was ingrained in them from the time they were a child that they should go to church. Thus, when they come to church as an adult, it's simply an extension of what they did as children. What you probably also noticed is that they had a fairly positive experience being in church, right? And when you have a positive experience as a child and an adolescence, then when you get to adulthood, you're going to want to continue that, and you're probably going to want to give that to your children. Would we agree with that? Okay. Now, what we also have to say, though, is that they are the exception and not the rule. Because you all know quite well, children don't really like to come to church, right? You have to force them to go. They go because their parents make them go to church. And when they're given the choice of whether or not they want to go, the vast majority of them will opt out. You want proof of this? Look at our confirmation classes. We get up here, we got 26 kids every year coming through here, and then 50 to 75% of them will never grace our doorsteps ever again once they are done with confirmation. It's not just true here, that's true all across the country for people who do confirmation. But for those who stay, right, for those who stick it out, the 25 to 40%, it's a very important thing for them. It gives them a sense of wholeness and belonging. You heard them say in there that going to church is like coming home to family. And they all kind of articulated something very, very central, which is that they come because of the people, right? The people are why they're here. They have these deep friendships that are very meaningful to them. These are people who love them for who they are. These are people who are there for them in the midst of the trials and difficulties of their lives. But most importantly, these are the people who help to make their faith stronger. Did you notice that correlation between the people and their faith? that they said that it is because of the people that their faith grows stronger. And so this is an interesting question for those people in the video. If you removed those relationships from the equation, would they continue to come to church? And of course, the answer is going to differ based on who you asked. For some people, the answer would be, well, if the relationships here just dissolved, then I just go find another community. You heard Kelly Dean say that when we asked the question, if you weren't raised Christian, would you become Christian? She says, I don't know. I know I'd find a community of like-minded people. Maybe it's in the church, maybe it wouldn't be, but the relationships are paramount there. And then you have another subset of people who, if you get rid of the people, they're not coming to church. These are the folks who, minus the relationships, their faith would dissolve. And then you have another group of people. These are the people who are going to come no matter what. Doesn't matter what people are in the church, they're going to be there. That's the 10% that I'm talking about. And the interesting thing about these particular people is that their faith is anchored in something very, very different from everyone else who comes to church. Their faith is not anchored in the need to be social with people. It's not anchored in the fact that they were born in it and they were raised in it. It's not even anchored in the fact that it's habitual for them to come every single week. It's not a habit for them to just simply be here. No, their faith is anchored in the notion that they have had some individual experience, and that experience is fundamental to who they are as a person. Now, we read about one such experience when we looked at Paul's conversion, right? And we read two different takes on it. We read Paul's own take on it in Galatians, and we read the take on it of Luke from Acts. Let's start with Luke from Acts, because that's a really interesting way of looking at Paul's conversion, right? So how does that go, right? He's walking along, and Paul's just persecuting Christians left and right, and then he's on his way going to Damascus, and all of a sudden a light comes around him, and he's knocked to the ground, right? And he can't see anything. And in the middle of being on the ground, Jesus starts having a conversation with him. And this conversation, it's so profound that it totally transforms his perspective. Whereas before, he was persecuting Christians, now he is one of them. Now, we don't know whether or not Luke's version of this is entirely accurate to what actually happened to him. But what we do know is that he became so grounded in that experience that he went around and he started forming churches all over the Mediterranean. In fact, many scholars will tell you that if it wasn't for this guy Paul, the Christian church wouldn't have made it out of the first century. We would not be here if it wasn't for what he did. Now, clearly, whatever it was that he experienced, he came away from that with the conviction that what he believes is absolute truth. There is no doubt in his mind that Jesus is the Lord and Savior of all humanity. And this is something that you see that is very common among the most dedicated adherents across all religions. This is the 10% who will never abandon their religion because to them, their faith is a fact. In their mind, there is no difference between the laws of gravity and their belief in Jesus. Gravity is negative 9.2 meters per second squared, and Jesus died for your sins so that you could go to heaven. It's not up for debate. It's just a matter of whether or not you accept it to be true. Now, we tend to look at these people as being the true believers, right? I mean, they have unflappable faith. They know it in their bones, and so they treat their faith as though it were a fact. But I have to tell you, I got a little bit of a problem with this because faith is not a fact. The very definition of faith is a strongly held belief or theory, meaning that whatever it is that you believe in, it cannot be proven. Now, it doesn't mean that there's no truth in what you believe. It just means you can't treat your faith as though it were factual. And isn't that what real faith is all about? Acknowledging that you could be wrong? Isn't real faith about examining all the evidence contrary to your position and holding that evidence in tension with what you believe? You see, I think that real faith is always coupled with doubt. And real faith is always comes with the understanding that it is a choice that you are believing in whatever you choose to believe in, and that everybody has the right to make their own choice. But that's not the way the 10% see it. Oh no. Their faith is not a choice. Their faith is a necessity, and they have trouble understanding why everybody else doesn't see the world the way they see the world. And if you've ever had interactions with the 10%, you know that when you start challenging them on what they believe, they are going to get upset, and they're going to cut you out of the conversation because they don't want anybody challenging what they're saying. And furthermore, what you also see is that they will often try to stamp out all competing voices because they want to impose their version of what they believe on other people. And sadly, what I see to be happening in the church right now, as the church goes through its decline and we're getting closer and closer to that 10%, they're becoming the strongest voices in the room. And it's only expediting the church's demise. This is why what you saw in that video this morning is so very important. Because I hope what you noticed is that none of those people in that video are like the 10% that I am describing. And that's a good thing. Every single one of those people, they talked about how their faith was based in the community. And that has a downside, as I described. The downside is without the community, the faith goes away. But the upside to that is that by being in community, you are exposed to new and different ways of thinking about things. By being in a community, your faith is challenged, your faith is stretched, but ultimately every single one of them said that it made their faith stronger as a result. And that's what real faith is all about. You are with people who have a variety of different views, and you allow those views to impact you and change your point of view on the world. In my opinion, true faith, faith at its purest, is a communal pursuit. And I know that this is the exact opposite of everything that you have been taught in your life up to this point. What have you been taught? That faith is an individual pursuit, right? Now, why do we believe that? Why are we told that? Because in America, we're really about individualism. That's big, right? The second reason is because you're told that your faith, right, what you believe, that's going to determine whether you go to heaven or hell when you die, right? Individual. And then finally, when you read the Bible, what are you looking at? You're looking at these individuals who had amazing faith and who did amazing things for God. And so we look at them and we hold these people up on a pedestal and we say, we want to be like that. We want to be like these individuals and do amazing things for God. But the fact is that as amazing as individual faith can be, it has a downside. And if you look at Paul, he's a perfect example of this. Okay, yes, if it wasn't for him, we would not have a church today. But you know what he's saying in that letter to the Galatians? You know what he's talking about? You know why he's describing his conversion experience? Because he's telling the people in Galatia very specifically that his version of the gospel is the only version they should pay attention to. That they need to discount every other version that they hear about and only listen to him. And I think that's a very dangerous thing. Because when your choice about what you believe becomes the only voice in the room, very quickly your choice becomes everybody else's choice. And that's what I want you to take away this morning. I want you to value what you have in this building. Because what we have here is something very unique and special. Yes, the church is dying all around us, but I can tell you something about the churches that are going to survive in the 21st century. It's the churches that are the most inclusive of the most voices that are still going to be standing when it's all said and done. And we do that really well in here. We have a lot of different voices in this church, people who are all over the place in terms of beliefs and where they are on the spectrum of their life views. And you know what? That's great. And I want to keep that going because in a lot of churches that are losing their membership rapidly, they're getting down to that 10%, and it's one way of thinking. But in here, you have people who truly love you for who you are. You have people who are willing to invest in you. You have people who have a diversity of viewpoint who are willing to walk aside you in this journey of trying to figure out what God's love is all about. And I think together we truly can do great things for God, because together, not as individuals, but together, our faith can change Arlington Heights and the world. I am proud to be a part of this community. I am proud to walk alongside you. And I have to tell you, it is an honor that you give me the privilege to stand up here each and every week to guide us to discover what our faith is truly all about. And to that, I will say amen.